One. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 139 of ASBN Live. I'm Tulasi Sivalingam, Senior Manager of Events and Programming, and I'm so thrilled to have these amazing speakers here with us today. Today's topic is Expediting Inclusive Resilience and Positive Impact through Climate-Friendly, Community-Centric Adaptive Redevelopment. This webinar was brought to us by one of our members, Hugo New, and we're so thrilled that Dominique Lueckenhoff is here today, bringing together this incredible panel, which she'll tell you a little bit more about. I'm excited because it was just Indigenous Peoples Day. And in this session today, we'll be talking about a project focusing on First Nations folks. So thank you, Dominique. Why don't you go ahead and take it away?
All right, great, thank you. And we want to thank American Sustainable Business Network for hosting this webinar and giving us an opportunity to share lessons learned in this age of inclusivity and climate. I'm Dominique Lueckenhoff. I'm Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs and Environmental Health, Safety, and Sustainability for Hugo New. Wendy New, our CEO, had planned to be here. She's been an incredible visionary in terms of some of the things we're talking about today and why we're doing them, but unfortunately had a major conflict come up. I'm sure she'll be following up to watch the video. Before I share a bit more of the Hugo News story, and with a particular focus on our address of water, flooding, resilience, we're surrounded by water in our model. I'd like to thank our panelists who've joined us from the Northwest and from Canada to share this incredible model approach that I know we're already keenly interested in, and that speaks to really where we are about inclusivity and integrating cultural aspects along with technology and design and redevelopment. Alex Lau, Mark Shieh, and Morgan Guerin are here, and we'll be talking about that model, particularly as it relates to residential redevelopment. Morgan is from the Musqueam tribe, and is going to be talking first about the First Nations approach. And I thought, given that we kicked this week off with Indigenous Peoples Day, let's say week and beyond, here in the U.S., I want to turn it to Morgan to help open up the panel.
Oh, thanks, Dominique. Siem Nisiaya and Sasetsaleno, dear friends and relatives. My name is Morgan Guerin. I'm a member of the Musqueam First Nation. I'm very, very happy to be here today to say a few words of welcome to start us off in a good way. It seems to me that we around Turtle Island at this time of year are starting to really put a good refocus and relearn and relive with our Indigenous people. And I'm very, very happy to be here today to do some of this ancestral protocol. So my people have been here since the beginning of time, we say since time immemorial. Many, many millennia in every little spot that we've been in, looking, tending, and stewarding Mother Earth, living with Mother Earth. And it was always a protocol when new people came into our territory that we would go greet them, made sure that they came in peace with good intention for Mother Earth, and then welcome them into our community so that we learn together how to look after Mother Earth in these areas. So I'm very, very happy to be here to share some of that with everyone today. And towards the end of September and the beginning of October, I know in Turtle Island in Canada, we just had the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation was recognized as a national holiday, which is amazing because it's a path forward of exactly that, the truth of our real history from prior to when Canada was Canada and when the US was the US, and the people who looked after the land, and the reconciliation about learning how we move forward together. Nutsamat in a good way. We say Nutsamat, one heart, one mind. And then also celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day in the US. Well, the borders are a human construct. They didn't exist to us. So we had family. So it's very easy for me to say that everyone virtually has come today in peace and has good intention in their heart. So I know on behalf of my nation, virtually for all of us from the Northwest, very easy to welcome you. We say "Emitsep Plachilm," which means you are all welcome. And we say "Chaitsep," which means thank you to you all. So thank you for all being here with a good heart today. I raise my hands to all.
Thank you. So with that, I'm going to launch into a bit about our Hugo New and our Kearny Point site. And Phyllis, if you can bring up the slides, if you're there. Yep. We entitled this Innovative Flood Risk Assessment. We were focusing on resiliency, but certainly in the previous slide, and in keeping with our wonderful and generous opening, Wendy New really, she's been trying to find words to call herself and our company anything but developer. In fact, she often says we are stewards, that this quote actually was so appropriate that we sort of came up with this mantra of private assets for public good. And of course, what we do on the land impacts the water, impacts everything, and we're all interconnected. And that's really the driver, the next slide, in terms of how we're looking at a 130-acre site owned by Hugo New, and with a mission-driven redevelopment. It's 130 acres. It's actually, if you can see that little map in the middle, it's on a peninsula. And at one time, I think actually the whole peninsula was owned by Hugo New, who purchased it in 1950. And it's on to the left as you view it, over towards the turnpike is the Passaic River. To the right is the Hackensack River. So we're pretty much surrounded by water, and actually heavily industrialized area, historically industrialized. In fact, the Passaic River is a Superfund site, and the Hackensack River was just listed as a Superfund site. But the principles that we're working on, and we sort of call it PACE: people, animals, community, environment, and it's all interconnected. We're focused on commercial, industrial, and manufacturing redevelopment, with an interest in inclusivity and creating meaningful jobs for a variety of people. We're in an urban enterprise zone, and we're surrounded by economically overburdened communities, but we're also very close to Manhattan, very close to Newark Airport. It's a huge region. Hudson County, where we're located, is the most populated county in the country. You can't retreat millions of people. So how do we use this opportunity to develop and create ways through which to balance what we do in the interest of overall resilience and sustainability? So the next slide. This history plays a big part. The site actually is a historically recognized site. It was at one point a federal shipbuilding site. The U.S. Steel Corporation developed it in 1917 as the federal shipyard. In fact, at one point we had one of the presidents, Roosevelt, actually came in at one point and ran the site. It was critical to the war, and in fact, developed steam turbine engine, which was used by Navy. And the next slide actually shares that. There's a memorial there. The work done at this site by over 30,000 workers. There was even a hospital on the site one time. Is actually given credit for helping to win the war. World War II, because so many destroyers were launched roughly every 13 days. They turned out a new destroyer for the war. So we have an interest, and as I mentioned, Hugo knew actually purchased the site early on, began to have ships dismantled by hand. And along with this site and other sites, in fact, around the world, became one of the world's largest heavy metal, steel metal recyclers. So the next slide. This site was passed down from Hugo knew, John knew, and then Wendy knew, and there were a variety of more industrial type activities going on around the site. And Sandy hit in October 2012, really devastated this site along with the surrounding areas and beyond, as we know, 70 billion in damages, according to NOAA. This site, so this is Central Avenue, which is right along our site, was under 4 to 5 feet of water. What you're seeing below is one of the tenants on the site was a liquor distributor, and with over $100 million in loss and beyond. So as you can imagine, this had a major impact on John and Wendy New in terms of what are we going to do next. So the next slide. Unfortunately, in 2013, John New was lost suddenly, lost his life, devastating blow. Wendy then took over and started to take some of the vision that she and John had discussed, which, okay, we're going to rebuild, we're going to do something transformative, and it's going to be how we can give back to the community and create more diverse jobs. There were tenants actually who stayed with them despite all the carnage and are still there. And you see Wendy and her partner, Steve Nislik, who was a seasoned developer at the time, sharing that they're going to launch this. The site has used recycled materials and adapted redevelopment, and has raised parts of the site actually above FEMA requirements for base flood elevation, and all in the interest of resilience. And the next slide, of course, in regards to that, focusing on small business growth, small minority-owned businesses with some subsidy, working with the state on how to support emerging businesses, incubators somewhat, fair and equitable workforce development. I'll mention later on that Wendy has dedicated 25,000 square feet to the governor's reentry workforce training program, green infrastructure, and innovative stormwater management. I actually, my background is I'm an alum of US EPA. I've worked across all programs, but more significantly in the water space and in the sustainable community space. And of course, climate was a big interest. And I really wanted to see it from ground level and influence it from ground level because most land is privately owned. So we have to figure out, how do we work with and as private sector in terms of addressing the adverse impacts that we're dealing with and being inclusive and assisting and partnering communities. So in that regard, we have a very strong partnership. We've been an anchor in the community, very strong partnership with the town of Kearny, with Hudson County, also with the state and local NGO groups. We have New Jersey Baykeeper actually has located on site. We're doing oyster studies. Healthy buildings, obviously historic preservation. We put solar in, we're doing a geothermal study. We're looking at sort of the range of and living shoreline of, how do we integrate and address water, energy, food, healthy lives, healthy ecology, particularly as we're now fighting a climate crisis. Next slide. And we actually supported the development, the design of a complete green street that runs right along. That was the sign that you saw on the earlier slide. And that was our contribution in working in partnership with the town of Kearny, which owns the street, and we hope to see more. So as we are looking at the next development, because we're sort of a site of sites, and Wendy New is considering, given the hundreds of millions of dollars going into redevelopment of this site, is, do I retreat? How do I do it? What do I do? I'm interested in, light manufacturing, sustainable movie studios, which, Wendy has business in that area as well. We do have a number of studios on site filming actively. How do we make sure if we're going to build that we're building for the next 50 years? Can we build for the next 50 years? How does water move around the site? And that's what really launched this flood risk assessment and resilience study to evaluate not just our site. We're in the Lower Passaic watershed. We've got the Meadowlands wetlands right above this. There's much of it now been destroyed, but thank goodness, because it still saved us from Sandy and from some of the storms that have ensued since then. But how is water moving in and around us, and how do we evaluate what we do in terms of resilience and sustainability? So the next slide were considerations that went into this study. Footprint areas and imported fill, which can provide enhanced retention, basically raising the site as we redevelop. Because we're in an industrialized area with legacy pollutants, we work through that process in terms of clean fill and things like that. We have a high groundwater table. We have to look at both, what's happening overland in terms of runoff and stormwater and storm surge. And as you see, we're surrounded by water. So sea level rise and tidal surge, very important. In fact, Sandy had significant tidal surge. And we were actually very, very pleased to be able to bring on international and national experts on our team, which was sort of a two-phase study. Was first to start to look at how water moves in and around the site, and then to do this 2D H&H modeling, this hydraulic modeling, in order to look at redevelopment opportunities and what it meant and what it would mean, and how do we do it, and how do we mitigate for it in terms of our next approaches to the site. So I do want to just mention, thanks to Celso Ferrero, who actually is on the international IPCC panel writing for the US, Seth Brown, who heads National Municipal Stormwater Alliance and is a seasoned modeler, and Shri Rangarajan with Bhumi, all whom teach this stuff, helped us to do the study. So the next slides, I think some of them are tuned in, and we'll do that more detailed overview later. Just quickly, this was the overview, flood risk assessment. The H&H, we use Innovise, which is a H&H modeling tool. And then identifying, based on those findings of both storm and tidal surge, what it's doing to the site, how high water is, where is it coming from, what are the right kinds of interventions at every level. Next slide. So if you, we obviously could not really do a meaningful study and limit it to our site. We needed to look at off-site drainage. In fact, just with the Hackensack Green Street, which I mentioned earlier, that basically runs along our site and through the site, over 27 acres of pretty much 99% impervious cover flows off onto that street, and then, onto our property, which is why we also had interest there. So this was just sort of giving you an idea both of the offsite drainage areas that we looked at the north end is roadway 1 and 9, which is owned, I believe, by both the town and the state. And then on the right, looking at sea level rise projections in terms of what to expect and where some of the hardest hit areas would be and how we mitigate. Next slide. So in terms of developing the model, it was important to also beta test it and looking at historical storms and what happened in terms of those historic site conditions and then existing site conditions. And once that model was tested against what actually happened, which it did, we were then able to do some of our own scenarios on site. So Hurricane Sandy, I mentioned earlier, there was very intense tide and the site was underwater. So you can see the red areas are the higher water marks, and the yellow, yellow to green are not as intense, but still with some intensity. Hurricane Irene in 2011, you can see the site, it had moderate high tide and extreme rain. Now you go over to Hurricane Ida a year ago and see that we really did not have significant impact. And that was more of an extreme rain and a typical tide. So obviously our site is much more heavily impacted by tidal, impacted by both, but significantly by tidal in terms of looking at those interventions. Next slide. And actually, you're not just looking at our site there. Actually, to the left of that sort of middle line, the dark area that you see the orange coming off of, that's offsite. And those are buildings on the other side of us that are around, that abut the Passaic River. So we wanted to see how water was moving from those areas onto our site. And this is the design storm that we used, which was a 10-year storm. And you're looking at it from the east of South Hackensack Avenue. And then, these are, in terms of baseline conditions, the areas where we have to focus on interventions. And then we played around with those interventions for a 10-year storm to see what the impacts were. So the next slide. So there's both coastal, as I mentioned, the tidal, and then there's overland flows and storm. And of course, we also know storm surge is not only impacting urban coastal areas, but now upland areas. It's a concern really for everybody, and these storms are getting more intense every year. In New Jersey, significantly more rainfall is projected in the next 10 years, which is why it's important that we can't continue to exist with 99% impervious cover, particularly in these kinds of areas. We were able to show, in fact, that all the roadways were going to be underwater. This is a major area of economic redevelopment, significant in terms of the commercial and industrial activity going on. We also have a NOAA and a county emergency response center. Well, nothing's going to happen when everything's underwater. And we were able to share the results of this study along with the suggested interventions with other stakeholders, and we're continuing to do that. We started with the town and with Hudson County to discuss those impacts. And in fact, Hudson County has a center that is right next to us on the water, which will have significant impacts. So coastal wall, you can see there, and actually we are talking about a green coastal wall, living shoreline and marshes. As we know, wetlands are much more better performing than gray in terms of addressing sea level rise. I mean, they're under attack by climate as well. We also know that water will have no place to go. We will have to put in certain degree of storage. We'll likely have to pump, but we're looking at everything from, green and purple roofs, which is purple is both detention and retention, green infrastructure, storage, along with green streets was another suggestion with storage. which, could have a significant reduction on those impacts. And the wall we looked at, so we've already raised some buildings to 14 feet. Base level is around 11 for the intense storms projected through FEMA and through the insurance, flood insurance study. And we're going anywhere from probably, 5 to 7 perhaps, maybe even as high as 17 feet in some areas that we're looking at based on the study. Next slide. So this is, what I've referred to earlier in terms of coastal. We can retreat, and as a number of communities are, and where I'm from in South Louisiana, how do you live with water? Do you resist? Do you raise it? That's what we've really been grappling with. But in the balance of running business, and that business, is supporting over 2,000 jobs now. In the next redevelopment, we're targeting, the support for another 2,000 plus jobs. Next slide. I think I'll quickly finish these up. I'm about done. So this is just a summary of the recommendations. We actually went into some specifics, and I had mentioned the coastal barrier because of, both sea level rise and storm surge. Those winds can be pretty impactful. So we have to have some type of coastal barrier, possibly with pumping. And so we're looking at this sort of integrated green pedestrian wall that will be at least 14 feet. We own our shoreline on the water, which is good, but we also are looking at how to make access for emergency response through our waterfront and activate our waterfront for public good. The study was actually able to show that wall will not only protect Kearny Point, our site, but actually significantly reduce impacts to both public assets and other private assets. And that's why we're trying to look at both shared risk and shared benefits. And that's what we were able to show through the study. Next. And I think I'm about just about done here. We were able to break out by these sub-drainage areas and the property footprints all around us, public and private, what that runoff was in terms of acreage. So that we've now got the metrics. And for Wendy New, who's looking at, tens of millions of maybe $80 million next investment, in terms of protecting the property from both storm and tidal, and this is how I summed it up. Wendy, you could do things all day long and continue to invest. That's why we've got to look at watershed approaches upstream and downstream. You'll always only be able to address about 47% of the problem because there's contribution all around you. And why, again, 53% of the runoff that's coming through our property is from offsite, both public and private, and why we're stressing the importance of collaboration and partnership, and also engaging the nearby disadvantaged communities and neighborhoods, many of whom work at Kearny Point or are going through the job training program. The next slide, I think, is it. So once again, this was sort of, I think I have to say, coming from EPA, I have not seen many developers do this, but being able to do it and do these types of scenarios and then to use this in order to engage each other on the ability to become resilient in the age of climate, the ability to kind of have some joint vision, and the long term, because we do have companies that don't reside there, and who are obviously benefiting from the area. So these types of studies, give us a bit more concrete ways to have those discussions. And that's it. I'd now like to turn it over. This was our commercial industrial piece, I'd now like to turn it over to Mark and Morgan and Alex.
Thank you, Dom. And good morning and good afternoon to you all. Hello from Vancouver. I'm delighted here to introduce the Main and Cordova project along with my colleagues, Alex and Morgan. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Earlier, Dom and Wendy, when we were talking about sustainability, the idea of resilience was front and center. And I'm going to share a little story about bamboo, which is prized in the Chinese culture for its resilience, that it can bend without breaking at a certain point. So let me start with this. Does that show up on, just give me a hands up?
Yes.
Yes, great. I'm a settler here. I immigrated with my family from Taiwan, and that is my baby picture. I have two sisters, and growing up, my parents would tell us this story, and they would give us a bamboo chopstick, and they would ask me, try to break it. And bamboo being resilient, it does bend, but at a certain point, it snaps. And then my parents would hand me a whole bundle of chopsticks, and they would ask me to do the same thing again. And of course, you can't. And the teaching of this is that as siblings, we are stronger together. Now, I see Morgan smiling because when I shared this story with Morgan, he said his family has a very similar story, but it's told through cedar and weaving. So today we're going to weave stories about bamboo. We're going to weave stories about cedar. We're also going to weave stories about a whole forest and something called mass timber and the living heritage approach altogether. This is our project site. It's named for the intersections of two streets, Main and Cordova. This question of how does a building becomes a good neighbor is what seeded this idea and what started us off. Along the way, Alex and I became very interested in the work of Suzanne Simard, who's a UBC professor, a forest ecologist, name dropped recently on last season of Ted Lasso. And her work discovers this idea that trees do communicate with each other, and a whole forest is a single organism wired for wisdom and care. And so this idea of a social forest gave us a lot of teachings, and we expressed them in terms of, for example, having places for social interaction and social exchanges at all different scales. So we have these social nooks, for example, at where you come out of the elevator. But Alex and I and Morgan, we're also interested in sustainability, and we were interested in this new material, this new way of building with mass timber that to us offered a path to low carbon cities. So with that, I invite Alex to talk to us more about mass timber.
Hi, everyone. Alex Lau with Golden Properties in Vancouver, and a really happy collaborator with Mark and Morgan on this project. So we're a real estate investor, second generation, and also clean tech investor. We're always looking for climate solutions. And one of the things that we discovered was that there's an unfortunate but maybe happily opportunistic intersection of these two, where buildings are responsible, it turns out, for 40 to 50% of global emissions. And of that, there's the operational carbon, and then there's also the construction carbon. And it turns out the construction carbon is a really knotty problem to try to solve. Concrete and steel are two of the most carbon intensive industries on the planet. A lot of people are trying to figure out how do we decarbonize those industries. But at the same time, we recognize that they are actually limited as building materials. Concrete and steel are very heavy. They're not necessarily super easy to work with. Concrete's very sloppy. Steel is basically made from iron ore, and therefore heavy, a little bit tricky to work with. Only certain kinds of people know how to work with it. So you require very specialized trades and a certain amount of time to build with these materials. And at the same time, we know that trees are incredibly light and strong. And so we've been very interested in carbon-based construction, just recognizing that the strength to weight ratio of wood inherently is much lower than steel. And over the last 20 odd years, there's been a lot of work done in this area called mass timber, which is an engineered approach to making wood buildings that are strong and resilient to fire and really beautiful. And this is kind of the when we think about what do we want to put into our building, if we want this building to be an example of how we can build, both from a community standpoint as well as benefiting the planet, it really looked like mass timber was the way to go. Mass timber has huge advantages, but it's a relatively new thing, so there's still a cost premium on it. We had an active investigation here to try to understand how can we bring down the cost of mass timber construction. Given the inherent benefits that we see from mass timber, the strength, the carbon benefits, the beauty, and the people's sense of comfort in these buildings, the biophilic aspect of it. It has all these advantages, but it's still coming at a bit of a price premium. So if we really want to make a difference in the world, we need to figure out how do we get mass timber cheaper than steel and concrete. And having been a renewable energy investor over the years, we've seen that happen for wind and solar power, which are now the cheapest ways of producing electricity. What can we do to get mass timber moving in that same direction? We think that the industry is already moving there, and our goal is to really accelerate the industry and moving in that direction. So some of the things that we looked at in our building here were taking a really more modular approach to the design, recognizing that this is a first of a kind. This is the first project of potentially many, and if we can design really efficient modules for this building, it will save in design and construction costs in future buildings. We also took a hybrid approach where we said, the wood is kind of it's already making a lot of economic sense for certain components of the building, such as the floors, but for the walls, there would be a bit more of a price premium. So we innovated in terms of using a form of steel called cold formed steel to make the walls of the building. So the vertical components of the building are all concrete and steel, and then the horizontal components are predominantly wood. We've got some illustrations here of just how beautiful wood-based construction can be. The projects here on the left and on the bottom are from a project in Perth, Australia, 600-foot tall wood building. In the upper right-hand corner, that's a vision of Paris, of one of the suburbs that has been designed in wood. So there's just a natural flow and comfort that you would have with these buildings that when you combine it with what we think will be a more cost-effective way to build, makes it, I think, a real natural for the industry to be moving in that direction.
Thanks, Alex.
Mhm.
So far, we've been talking about the more tangible aspects of our project, and I also want to talk about the more intangible parts. And this is a tough neighborhood. We have challenges and suffering arising out of poverty, addiction, mental illness, but there's a potential here. And we started asking this question of what is the potential here? How does this process, how does the building become a good neighbor? And one of our thinking is that we're dealing with complexity. So it's a dynamic system where a recipe approach will not work, that there isn't a recipe that we can say step 1, 2, 3 leads to a tidy solution. So instead, we've been thinking a lot about the more intangible things as well. And so this living heritage approach evolves from a materials-based approach where in the more traditional classical sense of heritage revitalization, you ask, how old is this building? What's its age? But beyond that and building on that, in this approach, the project team asks about the intangible values. So what do the people who live and work here in the past, now, perhaps in the future, what do they say about what matters about this place and why in their everyday lives? And so this approach really honors the stories that this place contains. And so from that, we develop principles, and from the principles, we express them in architecture, in design. So this is currently what the building looks like. On the outside, we're trying to evoke the seasons of a grove of maple trees that stood here long time ago. And we've included a learning place into it. We've included a community theater as well as local shops. But I want to invite Morgan to tell a bit more about how this design came about and the process and some of the highlight some of the design features.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. Myself and my group, Snowy Indigenous Consultants, were contacted by Alex, Mark, Tomo Spaces, and were presented with this project and exactly what Mark just talked about. How do we have this conversation about a building, a living building, something sustainable, where heritage starts from day one, rather than looking as something that was old and now we honor it, but rather from the ground up, how do we go about this? So they're asking the conversation of the story of the land. And of course, that starts with your local host nations are the caretakers and the stewards of the land. So in a very, very reconciliation-based approach, and I must say my hat's off to Tomo Spaces, Alex, and all of you involved, because without being able to quote some of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, they did them. So they brought us aboard to have a conversation about what this may look like and how to have conversations with the local nations about how to tell these histories, how to tell these stories, and start to weave them into the building from conception, rather than something that's an applique applied on after the fact. And these stories actually started to evolve into what the project looked like over time. So they started to plant the seeds, and it's been an exciting process with that. When we talk about our Indigenous people in this territory, we are referred to, in our Hunkaminam language, my Squamish family have a slightly different language and they have their own word, but we refer to ourselves as Huelmo. Muqwalmuk means people who are born of the earth. So not speaking about race, but by how you live your life. And understanding that you belong to the earth, not something you own. So like a child belongs to their mother, and a mother, and you know, that reciprocating sort of looking after each other and loving each other and living with each other and respecting each other. So that really starts from the ground up. So when we looked at that foundation and we were looking at some of the stories that we wanted to tell, one of them that did come up was actually when we're speaking about legacy. One of the pieces that we have is called a house post. So many know the Northwest Coast to be the land of the totems and totem poles. However, in our little neck of the woods, we didn't have totem poles. We had house posts, and some of them you can see beautifully illustrated, especially along the bottom, some of the black and white photos. In fact, I believe there's one there of my great grandpa is in the bottom left-hand corner. When we have that conversation about house posts talk about your ancestors and your teachings. But more importantly, they're actually a foundational piece. So they have little notches in the top or a flat on the top where a crossbeam in our old longhouses, which used to be over 1 kilometer long, these things were massive. A new generation would keep building off of onto it, living with it, having that reciprocal conversation with Mother Earth of, can I take this in order to build a home, and I will care for the land as I go. And these house posts would then have those teachings of an ancestor or an ancestor's teachings lining the inside of the house post or on the outside corners of the house post, reminding you every day of where you come from and your responsibility. So we had a bit of that conversation. And so when we look at some of what we would call an art install, or much more, because they leave a legacy long after we're gone of the responsibility of the teachings that go on those house posts, and not just the art itself. What do they mean? So the occupants, as they come to be in this space and respect this space, inherit that story to make sure that it's told in the right way and be able to cite where it came from and become part of that living chain. So the people and the building themselves become a legacy from day one, a legacy of respect and responsibility, especially when it comes to stewardship. We see a little railroad spike that's kind of in the middle there. That was another piece that was spoken about at the very beginning. In our territory, we have a teaching where there's a notch, there's a nail outside the house of every longhouse, where you hang up your preconceived notions, where you hang up your bad feelings. And so that way it's always hung at the entrance by the doorway, so you can leave it there. And then that way it's a transition point to walk into the home to bring in good feeling, Uitschwallen, we call it, a good feeling. And so that way your negativity's outside. You can come in and everyone who's in that space, that shared space, is safe together. You could see why this might be important in a house that's over 1 kilometer long full of people. You kind of want to make sure. And we really wanted to bring that teaching. And so it's not just in the piece there, but in the interaction of everything else that leads into, which also includes the construction material. As Alex spoke about before, you know, taking pieces of Mother Earth in a respectful way and using them. You know, they're the pieces that hold the home up. So giving that respect, that also goes in there, and doing the least amount of damage in order to make sure that we can continue living in this space, how to live with Mother Earth. I really love some of the other focal points. Mark was showing the outside of the building and how it had the different colors in there. And that's also respecting in our culture, there are very few places we have that are place names that refer to someone. Understanding what I spoke about, how we're part of Mother Earth, we belong to each other. You're describing Mother Earth rather than saying Mother, you know, such and such been brought to you by Pepsi, right? It's describing Mother's hair. So in this case, in that area, in our language, refers to the place of the big maples. So it actually speaks to what was there before, and the changing seasons that go with it. And there was a teaching even in that when you watch the life cycle of a tree, I was told, there's a life cycle to these trees, son, and you watch, and they're very much the same as you. They go through their youth, they go through their spring, they go through their fall, and they definitely have their winter. But it's their spirit will always remain the center of the tree. Mark was speaking earlier about chopsticks and cedar, and we very much have a very similar teaching along the lines of you can take those strands of wool, or you can take those strands of the cedar bark, and by themselves aren't very strong, but you bind them together and nothing can break it. That rope will never snap. In fact, it's much stronger than some of our tensile steel rope today. Or it can do something as strong as hold water. You can carry water together because you've held it together. So life itself can be sustained from one area to another. So there's a very strong teaching about how tight you stay together and look after each other. So this project has been an absolute honor to work on and to help facilitate. And our role in Snowyeth has been to help with some of the guidance of the local area, as well as how to make sure that we have those good conversations with the nations, and especially moving forward, we got some way to go yet. We have the artists who will be telling those histories, how to make sure that we've approached them in a respectful way and make sure that that binding teaching of responsibility and stewardship is maintained. And I'm very, very, very happy to be working with Tomo Spaces on that.
Thank you, Morgan. Dom, let me hand the speaking post back to you.
Okay, that was, I have questions, but I have to honor our guests that are tuning in. Because Morgan, I do want to ask you a question about how the community has received this type of approach. You know, how it's been made believable to people that have been marginalized by society. You know, as we look at working on environmental justice type communities, you know, like there's still a lot of distrust in coming in, but there is a question, and I think we have time. There's a question, maybe you can just answer that one, but John had a question. I think this one's for Alex or Mark. I don't know if Alex is still here, but about using wood and not having issues in terms of insurance claims or legal suits from using mass timber and other carbon sequestering materials. So Morgan, maybe you can answer my question. Mark can think about the last one while you do that.
No, my pleasure. The conversation is one that I think many of us in the Indigenous country have come to understand. There's a teaching that many of us share about multiple generations, and it can be found in different iterations. One that's commonly known as the 7 generations approach. Anything that's happened for 7 generations, you look back and you look forward for 7 generations. This also applies to healing. So if there has been multiple generations of healing, we know that there's multiple generations of healing to go. So when you come to that realization that you won't see the end of it, but your hands are responsible for making sure that they get to that place for the future. So that on the 7th generation, they see the light. And it is a thing that was something we will never do again. So when we have pieces, I'll give you an like for example, house posts and totem poles, right? Vancouver was known as the land of the totems, even though we are not a people of totems. So even then, our own art from our neighboring communities was placed in sort of displacing the actual stewards of the land from showing who they are and having their story not told. So something which seems as simple as erecting a house post, but more importantly, doing it with the story and the history and tact involved and the responsibility going forward with it, is a tremendous seed. My grandfather once told me, you can't give someone a tree, but you can give them a seed and show them what the tree looks like. And these are those seeds of reconciliation that we know if we nurture, grow into something so much bigger. So if we were to fix everything overnight, I think that would have just as many traumatic effects. So it's a matter of understanding that we are in this for the long haul. And I'm very, very pleased to see within my territory, we're seeing some of those small changes, but with bigger conversation. So it may be just a house post, but now it's more than just a piece. It's the responsibility that goes with it. So it's an exciting time to be alive for sure.
Mark, can you, I don't know if Alex is still here. But
Yeah, I'm happy to step in, and there's a nice segue to what Morgan was talking about and John's question. So mass timber, we were talking about bamboo and cedar fibers. So mass timber is different from, say, light frame that we usually see in construction sites, the 2x4 studs, because it is made up of wood fibers oriented in different directions and glued together. And that process, the result of that is a engineered wood product that when it burns, it'll char on its outside, but it won't burn. And so there's definitely engineering behind it. But in terms of your questions about legal specifications, in our city, we have the City of Vancouver Building Code, and then there's also the Provincial Building Code. They're making advances to allow for such type of construction. I believe in the United States, the code is even more advanced than ours. We're on the more conservative side. And then on top of that, you raise a good point that the insurance company during construction as well as after have a lot of say over this type of construction. But we are seeing more and more of mass timber buildings being built. And I'm happy to offline get into more details about the specifications.
I know we're about out of time, but I just want to ask one more question. Alex indicated, speaking of mass timber, he talked about this as biophilic design, and that in the connectivity with people, you know, they're happier, et cetera. And I'm a big believer in biophilic design. I also saw that he said it would become a carbon sink. So I kind of do the math. All right, you cut down a tree. Now you limit, you know, maybe talk about how a building with mass wood timber becomes a carbon sink.
Mm-hmm. So in a, let me see if I can quickly share this again. In a simple way, let's say we have a tree that is sustainably harvested and is being sustainably managed. Then as it grows, it's pulling carbon into its biomass. And then when we cut that tree, make a timber product out of it, now that carbon is stored in that piece of wood. And so that's the idea, that it, as a material, is able to capture and store carbon.
Okay. Have to think about that one. I'm not sure. I know, Thulsi, we're out of time. I could probably engage Mark and Morgan for longer, but out of respect for those who took time to view and tune in today, I want to keep things on time. And so I want to thank the panel, certainly thank Alex, Mark, Morgan. look forward to hearing more about what you're doing, and I'm sure there are going to be other communities interested. And I'm certainly going to take it, the idea, because I'm getting some thoughts. Everybody is in a place-based approach. There's a lot of culture. And our approaches have been a bit different about that, about how you bring it forward, particularly also recognizing the people who are there who can help nurture it towards the future. Really love that sort of spirit and resilience. So thanks again. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And that's it for today. Phyllis, I don't know if you want to say anything on behalf of American Sustainable Business Network, but thanks again.